Welcome back to the latest installment of Schnee Reads, Call of the Wild, Assignment 10, Chapter 4, Part 2. So as always, our standards are going to be the same, but one thing we're going to notice is that theme of Buck becoming more wild or more primal or primitive is going to be shown with this little prehistoric man that comes up in his dreams. This is going to be symbolic, and it's going to represent Buck returning to the wild. We are also going to look at the relationship between dogs and mushers, as well as their food and care, and you will be answering some Schoology questions, as always, using details from the text. So, what happened last time? With Spitz dead, Buck is eventually put in the lead position after some fighting with Francois and Perrault. He realigns the team, and they are running better than ever. Buck is a natural leader, and the team likes him. He's able to also do things that Spitz was never able to do. More dogs are brought in, but the team is getting a little tired because they've been run a lot with Francois and Perrault. They don't have a lot of rest. They are getting tired. And the team is eventually sold to another person. Francois and Perrault, they get new orders. And so they are moving on without their dog sled team. So once again, Buck is finding himself without a human in his life that he knows. There's no steadiness to this. It's very inconsistent. Every so often he is sold to a new person, and this is going to happen for most of the course of this novel. So this is once again his life up in the air. But he's going to be with a new musher who was also fair and kind. Um, and he is with his former dog sled team, so he still has them at least with him as well. All right, so we're going to watch this very, very quick video. It's only about 2 minutes about the care and feeding of sled dogs. What I want you to really take note of is how mushers examine their dogs for injuries and things like that, how the dogs eat, what they eat, and the amount of calories. Why did their calorie count have to be so high?
We've got fish, chicken, beef, tripe. There's probably at least 7 different kinds of meats in here.
Sled dogs are not your typical pets. They're super athletes, trained to run thousands of miles through some of the harshest weather on the planet. In order to succeed, a number of factors come into play, the most important of which may be nutrition.
These sled dogs, they're marathoners, they're supreme marathon athletes. So, as we all know, to have a great athletic performance, you need the genetics, you need the conditioning, and you need nutrition.
So what exactly do you feed these four-legged super athletes?
You know, there are a lot of specific aspects to the kibble formulations to provide the optimal benefit to these dogs. Now, a lot of the mushers will feed roughly half of the diet as meat products or fish, and then half kibble.
Sled dogs will run thousands of miles throughout the year. Putting out that much energy requires a lot of calories.
The studies have been done on Iditarod dogs. We're figuring they utilize about 10 to 12,000 calories a day. You know, that's a huge caloric intake. You know, to put that in terms that people might be able to relate to more directly, if the average sled dog's 50 pounds, say the average person's roughly 3 times that. So if they're using 10,000 calories a day for our dogs, the average adult human, maybe 30,000 calories would be an equivalent. So 30,000 calories would be, you'd have to eat 50 Big Macs a day.
That's a lot of food. So how often do mushers have to feed their dogs?
Each kennel kind of has their own way of doing it. Some mushers like to go smaller distances, shorter distances, and snack more frequently. Others will go longer distances and feed bigger meals.
So it's not just about being fast. What the dogs are eating and how often has a huge impact on how their bodies convert food into energy, making it possible for them to run such long distances.
You know, you could once again extrapolate to a race car. You know, if you don't put good fuel in it, all the other efforts are for naught. So without the right nutrition, they're not going to function nearly as well.
So you saw that really high calorie count, given the human diet typically is anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 calories a day, you can see how much these dogs are burning in just one day. Because they are running so far, so often, they have to have those calories to keep up that energy. Otherwise, they will fall short. So that is something that you are definitely going to need to keep in mind moving forward in this novel is how much do these dogs need to eat, and are they getting enough of what they need, especially in the next section that we start next week. We're going to start seeing that as a major issue. Also, look at the way the veterinarian examined the dogs. You know, he felt them for any sort of injury, checks their feet, checks their legs, and things like that. And these are some of the things that we're going to see in this section of the novel. So now that you have finished with this video, you're going to move on, or I should say continue with the next portion of the video for Chapter 4, Part 2. I believe it's only about 4 pages. It's not super long. And then when you're finished, you're going to, once again, do your Schoology quiz and use race for your short answers, please. So now we are going to continue on with Chapter 4, Part 2 of Who Has Won to Mastership. So if you remember, we mentioned it before that the dogs in the last section were sold. They are going to be sold to someone they refer to as a Scotch half-breed. It refers to someone who is either biracial or of multiple, I should say types, I'm sorry, of ethnicity. So Scotch means he's at least part Scottish, but we don't know what the rest of him is. It's not important, it's just how Jack London describes him. All right. A Scotch half-breed took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, he started back over the weary trail to Dawson. It was no light running now, nor record time, but heavy toil each day, with a heavy load behind. For this was the mail train, carrying word from the world to the men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. All right, so this man is not just taking government dispatches and information back and forth, he carries the mail. So letters get heavy, all of the supplies get heavy, and this team is going to be making a lot of trips because the mail never stops, no matter what the weather is. Buck did not like it, but he bore up well to the work, taking pride in it after the manner of Dave and Sol-leks, and seeing that his mates, whether they prided in it or not, did their fair share. It was a monotonous life, operating with machine-like regularity. One day was very like another. At a certain time each morning the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then, while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were under way an hour or so before the darkness fell, which gave warning of dawn. At night camp was made. Some pitched the flies, others cut firewood and pine boughs for the beds, and still others carried water or ice for the cooks. Also the dogs were fed. To them this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around, after the fish was eaten, for an hour or so with the other dogs, of which there were 50 and odd. There were fierce fighters among them, but 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so that when he bristled and showed his teeth, they got out of his way. So basically saying there's about 100 dogs hanging around, and all it took was 3 big fights for Buck for all of the other dogs to back down and realize Buck was really the master here. Best of all, perhaps, he loved to lie near the fire, hind legs crouched under him, forelegs stretched out in front, head raised and eyes blinking dreamily at the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and of the cement swimming tank, and Isabel the Mexican hairless, and Toots the Japanese pug. But oftener he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. The Sunland was very dim and distant, and such memories had no power over him. For more potent were the memories of his heredity that gave things he had never seen before a seeming familiarity. The instincts which were but the memories of his ancestors become habits, which had lapsed in later days and still later in him, quickened and became alive again. So he's not really remembering the good times with the judge and the life that he used to have that was, leisure and being king of the ranch. He's remembering the harder things and how his natural instincts have helped him to take over um, in this difficult time. So he is now being taken over by his instincts and he's learning to live like a real dog or a wild dog would have in this situation. Sometimes, as he crouched there blinking dreamily in the flames, it seemed that the flames were of another fire, and that as he crouched by his other fire he saw another and different man from the half-breed cook before him. This other man was shorter of leg and longer of arm, with muscles that were stringy and knotty, rather than round and swelling. The hair of this man was long and matted, and his head slanted back under it from his eyes. He uttered strange sounds and seemed very much afraid of the darkness into which he peered continually, clutching in his hand, which hung midway between knee and foot, a stick with a heavy stone made fast to the end. He was all but naked, a ragged and fire-scorched skin hanging part way down his back, but on his body there was much hair. In some places across the chest and shoulders and down the outside of the arms and thighs, it was matted into almost a thick fur. He did not stand erect, but with the trunk inclined forward from the hips, on legs that bent at the knees. About his body there was a particular springiness or resiliency, almost cat-like, and quick alertness as of one who lived in perpetual fear of things seen and unseen. So here, London is describing a very primitive man that Buck is dreaming about, almost like a caveman or prehistoric man. So this is bringing him back to Neanderthal days, when Buck's wild ancestors would have known a man like this, maybe would have searched him out or been wary of him. So this is just another symbol for Buck becoming more wild as the story goes. At other times this hairy man squatted by the fire with head between his legs and slept. On such occasions his elbows were on his knees, his hands clasped above his head as though to shed rain by the hairy arms. And beyond that fire, in the circling darkness, Buck could see many gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2, which he knew to be the eyes of great beasts of prey. He could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth and the noises they made in the night, and dreaming there by the Yukon bank with lazy eyes blinking at the fire. These sounds and sights of another world would make the hair to rise along his back and stand on end across his shoulders and up his neck, till he whimpered low and suppressedly, or growled softly, and the half-breed cook shouted at him, "Hey, you Buck, wake up!" Whereupon the other world would vanish and the real world come into his eyes, and he would get up and yawn and stretch as though he had been asleep. So basically, Buck's dreaming of all kinds of wild things at this point, of this man, of other animals who are waiting for him in the dark. And he spends most of his time dreaming of these things until the Scotch half-breed wakes him up. It was a hard trip with the mail behind them, and the heavy work wore them down. They were short of weight and in poor condition when they made Dawson, and should have had 10 days or a week's rest at least, but in 2 days' time they dropped down the Yukon bank from the barracks, loaded with letters for the outside. The dogs were tired and drivers grumbling, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail, greater friction on the runners, and heavier pulling for the dogs. Yet the drivers were fair through it all, and did their best for the animals. Each night the dogs were attended to first. They ate before the drivers ate, and no man sought his sleeping robe till he had seen to the feet of the dogs he drove. Still their strength went down. Since the beginning of winter they had traveled 1,800 miles, dragging sleds the whole weary distance, and 1,800 miles will tell upon life of the toughest. Buck stood keeping his mates up to their work and maintained discipline, though he too was very tired. Billy cried and whimpered regularly in his sleep each night. Joe was sourer than ever, and Sol-leks was unapproachable, blind side or other side. So even though their owner is fair and kind, and they do attend to their dogs first before the people, these dogs are being worked very, very hard. They are not getting the rest that they need, and because of that, they're all exhausted and cranky. And they're hurting and they're tired and they just want a break. But it was Dave who suffered most of all. Something had gone wrong with him. He became more morose and irritable, and when camp was pitched, at once made his nest, where his driver fed him. Once out of the harness and down, he did not get on his feet again till harness up time in the morning. Sometimes in the traces, when jerked by a sudden stoppage of the sled, or by straining to start it, he would cry out in pain. The driver examined him, but could find nothing. All the drivers became interested in his case. They talked it over at meal times, and over their last pipes before going to bed, and one night they held a consultation. He was brought from his nest to the fire and was pressed and prodded till he cried out many times. Something was wrong inside, but they could locate no broken bones, could not make it out. So Dave is suffering from some unknown illness or injury or something at this point, probably something like cancer, or he's just being worked to death and he's worn out and exhausted, one of the two. By the time Cassiar Bar was reached, he was so weak that he was falling repeatedly in the traces. The Scotch half-breed called a halt and took time out of the team, making the next dog, Sol-leks, fast to the sled. His intention was to rest Dave, letting him run free behind the sled. Sick as he was, Dave resented being taken out, grunting and growling while the traces were unfastened, and whimpering broken-heartedly when he saw Sol-leks in the position he had held and served so long. For the pride of trace and trail was his, and sick unto death, he could not bear that another dog should do his work. So even though Dave is sick and he's in pain, he doesn't want to rest. He lives for running in the traces. He even gets angry when they put Sol-leks in his position. And in this next session, he still tries to run with the sled like he's part of the team, not behind it, and he doesn't definitely want to get into it at all. When the sled started, he floundered in the soft snow alongside the beaten trail, attacking Sol-leks with his teeth, rushing against him and trying to thrust him off into the soft snow on the other side, striving to leap inside his traces and get between him and the sled, and all the while whining and yelping and crying with grief and pain. The half-breed tried to drive him away with a whip, but he paid no heed to the stinging lash, and the man had no heart to strike harder. Dave refused to run quietly on the trail behind the sled where the going was easy, but continued to flounder alongside in the soft snow where the going was most difficult till exhausted. Then he fell and lay where he fell, howling lugubriously as the long train of sleds churned by. With the last remnant of his strength, he managed to stagger along behind till the train made another stop, when he floundered past the sleds to his own, where he stood alongside Sol-leks. His driver lingered a moment to get a light for his pipe from the man behind, and then he returned and started his dogs. They swung out on the trail with remarkable lack of exertion, turning their heads uneasily, and stopped in surprise. The driver was surprised too. The sled had not moved. He called his comrades to witness the sight. Dave had bitten through both of Sol-leks's traces and was standing directly in front of the sled in his proper place. He pleaded with his eyes to remain there. The driver was perplexed. His comrades talked of how a dog could break its heart through being denied the work that killed it, and recalled instances they had known where dogs too old for toil or injured had died because they were cut out of the traces. Also, they held it a mercy, since Dave was to die anyway, that he should die in the traces, heart easy and content. So he was harnessed in again, and proudly he pulled as of old, though more than once he cried out involuntarily from the bite of his inward hurt. Several times he fell down and was dragged in the traces, and once the sled ran upon him so that he limped thereafter in one of his hind legs. So rather than let Dave die of a broken heart because he's taken out of the traces where he feels important and where he loves being, his driver lets him continue to pull the sled, even though he's bringing the team down and eventually injures himself. They know that Dave is going to die, so they give him this last little bit of consideration before he does. But he held out till camp was reached, when his driver made a place for him by the fire. Morning found him too weak to travel. At harness up time he tried to crawl to his driver. By convulsive efforts he got on his feet, staggered, and fell. Then he wormed his way forward slowly toward where the harnesses were being put on his mates. He would advance his forelegs and drag up his body with a sort of hitching movement, when he would advance his forelegs and hitch ahead again for a few more inches. His strength left him, and the last his mates saw of him he lay gasping in the snow and yearning toward them, but they could hear him mournfully howling till they passed out of sight behind a belt of river timber. So even though he's unable to walk, he still tries to drag himself to his place, and eventually the sled is taken out of range so the dogs can't see what's coming. Here the train was halted. The Scotch half-breed slowly retraced his steps to the camp they had left. The men ceased talking. A revolver shot rang out. The man came back hurriedly. The whip snapped, the bells tinkled merrily, the sleds churned along the trail, but Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had taken place behind the belt of river trees. So the driver brings the sled away from Dave so the dogs can't see what's going to happen. And then he goes back out of sight and shoots Dave to put him out of his misery. And then the sled moves on. He doesn't take time to bury him. He doesn't take time to mourn and to feel sadness. The job still has to continue. So the rest of the team continues. So now you are going to go through and do your Schoology quiz. Keep in mind your short answers. You should be using race format and at least 2 direct details from the reading. One of them should be a quote, or must be a quote at least. So why do you think the dogs ate before the men ate? And what does this show about the relationship between mushers and dogs? And then just describe the situation that happens to Dave. And I'm not just looking for the fact that Dave dies, but what happens to Dave? What does he become? Especially thinking about the part when he gets taken out of the traces. How does that really affect him? That's what I'm really looking for in this section. So now you're going to switch over to your Schoology quiz and finish that up, and then you will be done for the week. And we will pick this up again next week. Have a good one.